Welcome, dear listeners, to another case from the Drawing Room Detectives. Today, we begin a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, The Puzzle of the Poisoned Ink. When a series of anonymous letters start arriving at London's leading newspapers, each predicting scandals before they happen, Holmes and Watson are drawn into a dangerous game of media manipulation and political sabotage. Before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know. Now, settle in and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The Burned Editor. It was during one of those intervals of relative quietude which occasionally punctuated our lives at Baker Street that I happened to find Sherlock Holmes deep in contemplation and surrounded by the clutter of newspapers, monographs, and chemical apparatus. The spring light filtered dimly through the half-closed blinds, casting narrow bands of gold across the Persian slipper, the violin case, and the restless tapping of Holmes's long fingers upon the arm of his chair. "You have the look of a man underemployed, Holmes," said I, taking the chair opposite. "And you, Watson, have the gait of one who has this morning discharged his final patient," he replied, without glancing up. "I deduce, moreover, from the absence of dust upon your cuffs and the faint aroma of formaldehyde clinging to your left lapel, that you have paid a brief call to the laboratory before setting out." I laughed. "Your talents, Holmes, continue to render observation a most unequal contest." He smiled faintly, but whatever reply he might have offered was forestalled by the arrival of Mrs. Hudson, bearing a visiting card upon a tray. "A Mr. Harold Lytton to see you, sir," she announced. Holmes took the card, studied it, and motioned for the gentleman to be admitted. Our visitor proved to be a man of upright carriage and journalistic bearing, neatly dressed, though plainly agitated. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I am editor-in-chief of the London Gazette. I come to you not with a matter of libel or gossip, but something rather more insidious. I have in my possession a letter which has done me personal harm, and threatens, I believe, to do far worse to the public good." "Pray be seated," said Holmes with interest. "I take it your hand has been injured in the course of this business?" "Indeed," Lytton replied, removing the glove with some difficulty. 3 days ago I received an unsigned envelope bearing no indication of origin. It was addressed to me alone, and the letter within was composed in a curious, shimmering ink. Upon touching it, I experienced a stinging sensation which soon gave way to these burns. My physician was at a loss to identify the substance. "Curious," said Holmes, rising to inspect the hand more closely. "And the contents of the letter?" Lytton hesitated, then replied, "It detailed, with alarming precision, 2 political scandals which were subsequently revealed in rival papers within 48 hours. One concerned a naval procurement irregularity, the other an affair of moral compromise in a government office. Were you in possession of those facts at the time?" "I was not," said Lytton gravely. "The events had not yet broken. The information was prescient and evidently intended for my eyes only." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin and gazed thoughtfully at the hearth. "Poisoned ink delivering precise political prophecy," he mused. "This, Watson, is no common hoax. You did well to come." Chapter 2. The Venomous Correspondence. The morning after our meeting with Mr. Lytton found Holmes and me navigating the crowded thoroughfare of Fleet Street, where the air was thick with the smell of ink and damp newsprint. The pavements bustled with errand boys darting between delivery carts, their arms filled with freshly printed editions. Vendors shouted the latest headlines, and the distant clatter of printing presses rumbled like an underground storm. The offices of the London Gazette occupied a stone building with tall, soot-darkened windows and a brass plaque near the entrance that gleamed dully in the weak sunlight. Mr. Lytton awaited us inside, looking no less troubled than he had the day before. "I have kept the letter and its envelope exactly as I received them," he said, leading us past rows of desks where clerks and journalists worked in hurried silence. "They are locked away in my office safe." Holmes's sharp gaze roved over the newsroom as we passed through. His eyes lingered on a young man seated near the rear who was examining a sheaf of proofs with unusual intensity. Holmes said nothing, but filed the observation away, as was his habit. Lytton ushered us into his office, a cramped but orderly space lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. He produced the letter from a locked drawer, setting it gingerly upon the desk before us. Holmes did not touch it at once. Instead, he bent low over the paper, inhaling lightly. "There is a faint but distinct odour," he murmured. "Something sharp and vegetal with a trace of metallic bitterness. Not a commercial ink, that much is clear." He drew a small magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the lettering. The handwriting, though neat, bore obvious signs of deliberate disguise. The slant was inconsistent, the loops overly large, and the pressure on certain downstrokes betrayed an unnatural tension. "The penmanship was masked," Holmes said aloud, "but the writer is right-handed and accustomed to writing quickly. These hesitations suggest forced alterations." I watched as he lifted a single corner of the letter with the tip of his pencil and studied the paper itself. It was thick and fibrous, with a watermark that read Cascadura Mill, Para Province. "Brazilian manufacture," Holmes said with interest. "An uncommon choice for stationery in London." Lytton, still holding his injured hand protectively at his side, cleared his throat. "I should also tell you, Mr. Holmes, that mine is not the only office to have received such a letter." Holmes straightened at once. "Indeed?" "Yes," Lytton said. "In the last 2 weeks, 3 other editors, Mr. Glenroy at the Herald, Mr. Morris at the Evening Standard, and Miss Clarendon at the Weekly Record, each received similar missives. Each one predicted a different political or social scandal, and each prediction, I regret to say, came to pass within 48 hours. Holmes's expression darkened. "And the content of the letters? Similar in tone and style?" Lytton nodded. "Unfailingly so, short declarative statements with precise timing, no salutations, no signatures." "And were they all written in the same ink?" "I believe so," Lytton replied, "though I cannot speak to the matter of Burns in the other cases." From his coat pocket, Holmes retrieved a small glass vial and a metal scraper. With practised care, he collected a trace amount of the ink from the edge of the paper and sealed it away for later analysis. "I shall need to examine the letters from the other newspapers," Holmes said at last, "and I would like to speak with their recipients, if possible." "Of course," Lytton agreed. "I can make introductions." Holmes placed the vial carefully in his inner pocket, then gave me a glance that told me our day was far from over. As we stepped back into the noise and bustle of Fleet Street, Holmes's eyes glinted with determination. "Watson," he said, "this case is not merely a curiosity. We are dealing with a hand skilled in both deception and chemistry, and I suspect the true motive lies not in the ink, but in the message it seeks to deliver." Without waiting for a reply, he hailed a passing hansom cab, and we set off toward our next destination. Chapter 3: A Scandal Foretold. The following afternoon found Holmes and me seated in the office of Mr. Alfred Glenroy, editor of the Herald, a rival yet respected publication not far from the Gazette. Glenroy was a barrel-chested man with a booming voice and a reputation for publishing hard truths without fear or favour. On this particular day, however, there was a weariness about him that could not be ignored. "I confess, Mr. Holmes," he said, holding up a bandaged hand that mirrored Lytton's injuries, "I thought the burns were some unfortunate reaction to the paper itself." Only when Lytton reached out to me did I begin to suspect something more sinister. Holmes, seated with one leg crossed over the other, examined the dressing with clinical interest. You opened the letter in the same manner, barehanded, without hesitation? Precisely. The envelope arrived last week. No return address, no markings. I tore it open as I would any correspondence. Within seconds my fingers were burning as though I had plunged them into lye. Holmes nodded, his mind already moving along its invisible tracks. And the contents? Glenroy gestured to a folder on his desk. Holmes retrieved it carefully, opening the cover to reveal another single sheet of paper, the same thick Brazilian stock as before, with the now familiar iridescent ink. The message was brief and chilling. By the time you read this, the member for South Kennington will have resigned in disgrace. The story breaks tomorrow. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And did it? It did, Glenroy replied grimly. A bribery scandal tied to railway contracts. We had the story confirmed by noon the following day. Holmes fell silent for a long moment, studying the letter as though willing it to yield its secrets. The timing is precise, he murmured at last. The letters arrive just before the scandal becomes public knowledge, giving the appearance of foresight, though in truth the sender must possess advanced knowledge of these events before they unfold. You believe the writer is connected to the sources of these scandals? I asked. Undoubtedly, Holmes said, either as an insider or through a network of informants. Glenroy cleared his throat. There is something else. Another letter arrived this morning. At this, Holmes's head lifted sharply. You have it here? Glenroy opened a locked drawer and produced the latest envelope, still sealed and handled with great caution. I did not dare open it after what happened before, he said. Holmes examined the exterior. The handwriting matched the earlier letters with the same disguised slant and forced loops. The paper bore the same faintly metallic odour. With your permission, Holmes said, withdrawing a pair of gloves from his coat pocket. By all means, Glenroy replied, leaning back. Holmes slit the envelope open with the edge of a letter opener, carefully sliding the single sheet free. He read it aloud. Diplomatic trust will fracture before the ink dries on the treaty. Watch the headlines within 48 hours. Glenroy's face paled. Surely not the Anglo-European Accord. The negotiations have been the Crown's chief concern for months. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he read the letter a second time, then folded it neatly and returned it to the envelope. Tell me, Mr. Glenroy, he said, at what hour did this arrive? Shortly after 8 this morning, Glenroy replied. Holmes glanced at his watch, then turned to me. Watson, make note of the delivery time. If I am correct, these letters are dispatched with extraordinary calculation. The sender is not reacting to the scandals after they happen, but is timing the arrival to anticipate them by mere hours or days. And the ink, Holmes, I asked. Surely such a substance is not easy to procure. Indeed not, Holmes said with quiet satisfaction. Which is why our next visit shall be to the few chemists in London who specialize in exotic plant toxins. Before we departed, Holmes paused at the door and turned back to Glenroy. Should you receive another letter, do not open it, he instructed. Send word to me at once. Glenroy nodded solemnly. As we stepped back out into the cold afternoon light, Holmes's expression grew more focused than ever. Chapter 4. The Ink Analysis. The following evening found Holmes deep in the heart of his laboratory work, the sitting room at Baker Street transformed into a chaotic display of glassware, pipettes, and steaming flasks. The familiar scents of iodine and alcohol hung heavy in the air, mingling with something more acrid and unfamiliar. I sat by the window, observing him with a mixture of fascination and resignation. For the better part of 2 hours, Holmes had moved from bench to microscope, then back again, stopping only to jot rapid notes into his worn leather notebook. The samples from both Mr. Lytton and Mr. Glenroy's letters lay in petri dishes upon the table, alongside thin glass slides and strips of blotting paper. Holmes held one of the stained slides up to the gaslight and examined it closely through a small brass microscope. "A curious composition, Watson," he said at last, without lifting his gaze. "Not the work of any commercial ink manufacturer, that much is certain." I rose and moved closer, peering over his shoulder. "What do you find?" "The ink appears to contain a suspension medium of glycerin, most likely to prevent the toxin from drying too quickly," he replied. "The pigment is a mixture of indigo and a mineral-based dye, probably to create that unusual iridescence we observed. But it is the third component that interests me most." He pointed to a small beaker on the table where a cloudy liquid swirled faintly under the light. "Traces of a South American plant extract," Holmes continued. "Derived, if I'm not mistaken, from the sap of the Euphorbia latissima, commonly known in certain regions as the devil's milk." I frowned. "A dangerous substance?" "Indeed," Holmes said, setting the slide aside. "In its concentrated form, the latex from this plant can produce severe skin irritation and chemical burns upon contact. Natives in parts of the Amazon basin use it in ceremonial rituals, often to mark initiates or drive away intruders from sacred grounds." I could not suppress a shudder. "But why use it here? Surely there are easier means of discouraging unwanted readers." Holmes smiled faintly. "That, Watson, is where the true ingenuity of the matter lies." He crossed the room to where he had set up a small retort and began heating another sample over a spirit lamp. "Consider the effect," he said as he worked. "The poison is not lethal. It is painful, but not permanently disabling. Its only certainty is that the person who opens the letter will be marked by visible injury, blisters, burns, redness, all impossible to conceal for several days afterward." He glanced at me, his expression sharpening. "The result, my dear Watson, is that only the intended recipient, the editor, would open and handle the letter personally. Subordinates, clerks, and office boys would quickly learn to leave these envelopes untouched for fear of injury." I nodded slowly as understanding dawned. "So the writer ensures that each letter reaches the hands of its target. The burns serve as both a deterrent and a signature." "Precisely," Holmes said. "An unusual method of targeted delivery, but remarkably effective. The editor receives the message, suffers the injury, and perhaps more importantly, remembers the sender with every painful reminder that lingers on the skin." He turned back to his analysis, removing the beaker from the flame and holding it up to the light. The liquid had settled into 2 distinct layers. "The toxin is soluble in alcohol but not in water," he murmured. "Interesting. That will help narrow down its preparation." I observed him for another moment, then asked, "And what of the paper? That Brazilian watermark, surely that too is significant?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "Indeed it is. I have already made inquiries to certain paper merchants who deal in imported stocks. There are only a handful in London with access to material from Pará province. I expect word from them by morning." As Holmes began cleaning his equipment, a light knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram upon a silver tray. Holmes took the slip of paper, read it swiftly, and smiled with satisfaction. "Ah, excellent," he said. "Confirmation from one of my contacts at the docks. A shipment of Brazilian goods arrived 3 weeks ago. One of the recipients paid in foreign coin and requested a large order of Cascadura mill paper." He folded the telegram and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. The web tightens. We have identified the poison, the paper, and the means of delivery. Now it remains to uncover the hand that guides them all. With that, Holmes reached for his coat and hat, already moving toward the door with the relentless energy I had come to know so well. Chapter 5. The Shadow in Fleet Street. The following evening found Holmes and me positioned in a narrow alleyway off Fleet Street, pressed into the shadows between a tobacconist's shop and a shuttered printworks. The gaslights along the pavement glowed faintly in the gathering dusk, their flickering light casting long, uneven shadows across the cobblestones. The air smelled of ink, damp wool, and the distant tang of coal smoke. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the London Gazette building across the street. His collar was turned up against the cold, and in the dim light his sharp profile took on a strangely hawkish quality. "We are looking for a man who favours dusk for his errands," Holmes murmured, barely above a whisper. "A creature of habit, Watson. Such men always are." For the past 2 evenings Holmes had observed the comings and goings of Fleet Street with quiet intensity, noting the movement of messengers, clerks, and delivery boys as they bustled in and out of the newspaper offices. But tonight he had insisted we arrive earlier, convinced that the sender of the poisoned letters would make another appearance. At precisely 5:30, Holmes gave a slight nudge to my arm. "There," he said quietly. Emerging from the far end of the street was a solitary figure. The man walked with deliberate slowness, pausing briefly at each corner as though checking for observers. He wore a long dark coat and gloves despite the mildness of the evening air. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his brow, obscuring much of his face. We watched as the man approached the entrance to the Herald offices. With gloved hands, he withdrew a small envelope from inside his coat and slipped it through the brass letterbox before continuing along the street. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Take note of the gait, Watson. Limp in the left leg, favouring the right foot. Possibly an old injury." The figure moved on, stopping at the door of the Weekly Record. Another envelope was deposited, followed by a cautious glance up and down the street. Satisfied that he remained unobserved, the man turned and began heading eastward toward Ludgate Circus. Holmes stepped back into the alleyway. "I shall remain here and continue my inquiries," he said swiftly. "You, Watson, will follow our friend. Keep to the shadows, observe where he goes, whom he meets, and, if possible, where he retires for the night." I nodded, my heart already quickening with the thrill of the chase. "Do not engage him," Holmes added, laying a firm hand on my shoulder. "Simply watch. Report back here within the hour." Without another word, I slipped into the growing crowd and began tailing the man at a cautious distance. The figure moved with purpose, but not with haste, weaving between horse-drawn cabs and newspaper vendors. More than once he paused to look behind him, but I kept well out of sight, ducking behind gas lamps and doorways whenever he turned. Meanwhile, Holmes remained on Fleet Street, making his rounds among the small printing shops and ink suppliers. Earlier that day, he had prepared a list of vendors who dealt in exotic pigments and imported papers. Knowing his methods as I did, I was certain he would begin posing discreet questions to shopkeepers and stationers, inquiring about recent customers with unusual requests. As I followed our quarry down a side street near St. Bride's Church, he disappeared through a narrow iron gate leading to the rear entrance of an old boarding house. I waited a prudent distance away, noting the address and the name on the faded sign above the door. Satisfied that I had learned all I could for the moment, I retraced my steps back toward Fleet Street to find Holmes. When I returned to our designated meeting point, I found him emerging from a small shop with a self-satisfied smile. "Excellent timing, Watson," he said, drawing me into the shadow of the alley once more. "I believe we are closing in on our elusive letter writer." I recounted my observations, including the man's destination and the details of the boarding house. Holmes listened with keen interest. "Very good, Watson. Very good indeed. Tomorrow morning we shall pay a visit to Langley House. But first, I have one or two final questions for a certain ink merchant who may prove most illuminating." And with that, we withdrew into the night, the mystery deepening around us like the London fog that rolled steadily in from the Thames. Chapter 6. The Printer's Clue. The next morning found Holmes and me walking through a warren of narrow streets south of Fleet Street, where the air was thick with the mingled smells of ink, glue, and damp wood. The shop-fronts here were modest affairs, their windows cluttered with samples of stationery, printing blocks, and dusty bottles of ink in every imaginable shade. Holmes paused before a small, dimly lit shop wedged between a tobacconist and a cobbler. The faded sign above the door read, "Merrick and Sons, Printers and Stationers, since 1842. The interior was cramped and smelled of linseed oil and varnish. Wooden trays of typeface lined the walls, and stacks of paper lay bundled in the corners. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with ink-stained fingers and a pair of cracked spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Good morning to you," the man said, squinting at us. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Holmes stepped forward with the easy confidence that often won him cooperation in such places. "Mr. Merrick, I presume?" "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are investigating a matter which may touch upon your line of work." The printer's brows rose. "Indeed?" "Well, I have little to do with anything outside my presses these days, but if I can be of service, I will." Holmes withdrew a folded piece of paper from his pocket and laid it upon the counter. It was a sample of the Brazilian stationery taken from one of the poisoned letters, carefully handled with gloves. "Have you, by any chance, sold paper of this particular make in recent months?" Holmes asked. Merrick adjusted his spectacles and examined the sample closely. After a moment, he let out a low whistle. "I'll say this, Mr. Holmes, that is not a common paper stock. Cascadura Mill, Pará Province. I have only had one customer request." Holmes's eyes brightened. "When was this?" 2 months past, near the end of January," Merrick replied. "The gentleman was most particular, came in wearing gloves and a scarf wrapped high around his face, never removed them the whole time he was here." "Did he give his name?" Holmes asked. "No, sir," Merrick said, shaking his head. "Paid in advance and insisted on cash, though now that I think of it, the coins he gave me were foreign, silver ducats if I am not mistaken, Eastern European judging by the stamp." Holmes's expression grew even more attentive. "What exactly did he order?" "A custom blend of paper stock, as you see there," Merrick said, tapping the sample with a bony finger. "And he asked for a batch of specialty ink as well. Wanted something with an iridescent quality. Said it needed to remain wet and viscous longer than standard ink." "Did you mix it for him yourself?" Holmes asked. "I did not," Merrick replied. "I sent him to Mr. Kellett at the inkworks down on Pemberton Street. They handle custom pigments." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "And after that?" "Never saw him again," Merrick said. "Collected his order a week later and vanished, left no address, no forwarding information. I did wonder at the time, but I assumed he was one of those eccentric artist types." Holmes smiled faintly. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Merrick. One final question. Did he arrive on foot or by carriage?" "On foot," the printer said after a moment's thought. "Came from the direction of the Holborn Viaduct and left the same way." Holmes nodded, satisfied. "Thank you." We stepped back into the street where the morning fog still lingered in patches along the gutters. Holmes stood for a moment, gazing down toward Pemberton Street. "Our mysterious correspondent," he said at last, "is a man who takes pains to obscure both his identity and his movements. Foreign coin, foreign paper and ink, designed for both beauty and harm. But even the most careful criminal leaves traces, Watson. He turned, already striding briskly toward our next destination. "Come," he said over his shoulder, "let us pay a visit to Mr. Kellett. The ink may yet reveal the hand that mixed it." Chapter 7. A Diplomatic Connection. It was nearing dusk when a familiar knock came at the sitting-room door of Baker Street. 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause and a fourth, precise, unmistakable. Holmes looked up from the array of notes spread across the table. "Mycroft," he said, without turning his head, "rather sooner than I expected." Mrs. Hudson entered with a faint frown, carrying a silver tray upon which rested a sealed envelope. "From the Diogenes Club, Mr. Holmes," she said. "The gentleman is downstairs, and he asks whether you might spare him a few moments." Holmes took the envelope and broke the seal. After reading the brief note within, he stood and reached for his coat. "I must leave you briefly, Watson," he said. "This summons cannot be ignored. I shall return within the hour, possibly with fresh intelligence." "From your brother?" I asked, rising. He gave a thin smile. "Yes. And if he is taking the trouble to summon me in person, then the matter is not merely delicate, it is dangerous." With that he swept out into the growing gloom, leaving me with the quiet hiss of the fire and a stack of ominous letters still resting on the table. It was well past 7 when Holmes returned, his step brisk and his face marked with grim concentration. He flung his gloves onto the sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy before sinking into his chair. "Mycroft has confirmed what I feared," he said. I leaned forward. "This is about the treaty, then?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The Anglo-European peace accord, which has occupied the better part of the Foreign Office for months, is now under direct threat. Several last-minute amendments have created tensions among the negotiators. British intelligence has intercepted whispers of dissent being fed to the press, not by rogue journalists or disgruntled staffers, but by agents working on behalf of a foreign power." I frowned. "You suspect the same hand behind the poisoned letters?" "I do not merely suspect it," Holmes said. "I am now nearly certain of it. The timing of each scandal, the targeted delivery, the calculated nature of the ink, all point to a single conclusion. Someone is using London's press as a weapon to destabilize the diplomatic process." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out into the lamplit street below. "Mycroft believes," he continued, "that a certain figure recently arrived in London may be behind the scheme, a diplomat operating under the name Vladislav Petrovich, officially attached to a minor Eastern European embassy, but long suspected of engaging in what is politely called unofficial influence." I recognized the name at once. "Petrovich, the same who was expelled from Paris 3 years ago?" Holmes nodded. "The very one. In France, it was suspected he engineered the release of forged political letters which nearly upended a ministerial election. In Berlin, he was linked to the theft of confidential military memoranda. Both times he vanished before charges could be brought. Now he has appeared in London, attending salons and official gatherings, keeping just within the bounds of diplomatic immunity. And Mycroft believes he is involved here?" "He would not say it outright," Holmes replied, "but he all but placed the name in my mouth. The truth is, Petrovich has both the motive and the temperament. He views political negotiation as a chessboard and the press as his rooks and bishops." Holmes returned to the table and began flipping through the letters once more, examining them with fresh eyes. "There is something deliberate in the tone of these messages," he said. "Each one not only forecasts scandal, but seems designed to erode public trust in authority. Ministers disgraced, policies questioned, alliances fractured, and now The letter predicting that trust will be broken before the treaty is signed. I considered the implications in silence. "What do we do?" I asked at last. Holmes tapped a finger against the edge of a letter. "We find Petrovich, we observe him, and we determine whether he is merely a guest at the diplomatic table or the man poisoning the ink behind the scenes." He stood and reached for his coat once more. "Tomorrow evening, Watson," he said, "we attend the ambassador's reception at Belgrave House. Petrovich will be there, and if my instincts are correct, so too will the next move in his game." Chapter 8. The Decoy Letter. The next morning, Holmes appeared more animated than I had seen him in days. He stood at the mantelpiece with a sheaf of paper in one hand and a bottle of ink in the other, speaking quickly and with purpose. "We shall give our adversary an opportunity to reveal himself, Watson," he said. "Thus far he has controlled the flow of information. Today we shift the balance." I looked up from my chair where I had been reading over notes from our Fleet Street observations. "You mean to bait him?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A false letter written in the same theatrical hand, on the same type of imported Brazilian paper. The only difference is that this one shall contain nothing of value and none of the venomous ink. A harmless forgery, but planted where the original letters have done the most damage." He sat at the writing table and began composing the counterfeit letter, carefully mimicking the exaggerated loops and rigid slant of the original handwriting. The message was vague, a suggestion of an impending scandal involving a high-ranking trade official and a supposed scheme to divert funds to a private company. "Convincing enough to tempt interference," Holmes muttered, "but false enough to expose the meddler." Once the letter was sealed and dried, Holmes wrapped it in a plain envelope and handed it to me. "To the London Gazette, Watson. Ensure it is delivered into their general correspondence box before mid-afternoon. Then we shall return at dusk." That evening we took our positions in a narrow corridor overlooking the Gazette's main editorial room. Holmes had arranged with Mr. Lytton to give us discreet access to an unused loft space above the offices. Through a ventilation grille, we could observe the room below without being seen. The room was mostly quiet at that hour. The senior staff had left for the day, and only a few clerks remained, tidying desks and gathering correspondence. Among them was a young man we had noticed during an earlier visit, a slight fellow with thinning hair and an anxious manner. His name, Lytton had told us, was Percy Lang, a junior clerk responsible for handling and sorting incoming letters. Holmes's eyes were fixed on Lang. "There," he whispered, as the clerk approached the table where the decoy letter had been placed that morning. Lang glanced over his shoulder before lifting the envelope. He turned it in his hands, examined the handwriting, and then, after another furtive look, slipped it into his coat pocket rather than the appropriate sorting tray. Holmes's mouth curved into a thin smile. "Patience, Watson," he said softly. "Let us allow him to act on his instructions." We waited another quarter-hour as Lang lingered around the room, pretending to busy himself with meaningless tasks. At last he left, descending the stairs toward the side exit. Within moments Holmes had moved. We descended from our perch and emerged into the alley behind the building just as Lang exited into the evening fog. Holmes stepped into his path. "Good evening, Mr. Lang." The young man froze, his face draining of colour. I beg your pardon." Holmes gave no introduction. "You have something in your coat pocket that does not belong to you." Lang looked between us, then made a sudden turn as if to flee. Holmes caught him by the arm with a grip like steel. "I would not recommend that," he said coolly. A scuffle was unnecessary. Lang, trembling now, was quickly subdued and ushered back into the Gazette offices, where Mr. Lytton, summoned by telegram in advance, had set aside a private room for questioning. "I am not a thief," Lang said as soon as we seated him. "I did not mean any harm." "No harm," Holmes said, placing the unopened envelope on the table. "Yet you removed private correspondence and attempted to conceal it. Start with the truth, Mr. Lang. Who instructed you to interfere with the letters?" Lang's composure broke. "He said it was only for a few weeks," he blurted. "He promised nothing would happen to anyone. Only that I should watch the editor's correspondence, and if any strange letters arrived with that odd-looking ink, I was to inform him at once." "Who is he?" Holmes asked. Lang hesitated. "I do not know his real name. He came to me outside my boarding house 3 weeks ago. Said he knew about my father's debt at the betting house, said he could make it disappear if I cooperated." Holmes's voice was low and steady. "And did he?" Lang nodded miserably. "The debt vanished. The bookmaker said it had been paid in full. Since then I have been passing along details, where the editors sit, who sorts the mail, which messengers come and go." "Did you ever see his face clearly?" I asked. "Only once," Lang said. "He wore gloves and a hat most of the time, but one evening he removed it while speaking to me. He had a scar just above his left eyebrow. Thin and pale, but deep." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Then he turned back to Lang. "You will write a full account, and you will do so honestly," he said. "Mr. Lytton will ensure you are protected from retaliation, but if you hold anything back, I shall know, and the consequences will no longer be in your favour." Lang nodded quickly. Holmes rose and gathered his coat. "We are close now, Watson," he said once we were alone again. "Too close for our opponent's comfort. He has begun to use pawns, and pawns are fragile things. When they break, they often speak." Chapter 9. The Masked Scribe. It was a bleak, wind-swept evening when Percy Lang led us down Greymire Lane, a neglected stretch of alley near the river, flanked on both sides by crumbling brick buildings and empty gas lamps. The fog rolled low and thick across the cobbles, muffling the echo of our footsteps as we approached a shuttered boarding house with peeling green paint and a tilted sign that read Langley House, Weekly Rooms. "This is it," Lang whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "He rented the top floor 2 weeks ago under the name Mr. Reed, but I once heard someone call him Verek when they thought I was out of earshot." Holmes gave a slight nod. "You have done well, Mr. Lang. Now remain outside. If you see anyone approach the building, signal twice." Lang backed into the mist, his shoulders hunched and pale face barely visible. Holmes turned to me. "Our masked scribe keeps a nest here," he murmured. "Let us see what birds he's been hatching." With Holmes in the lead, we ascended the narrow stairwell, each step creaking under our weight. At the top, the hallway was lined with cracked plaster and faded wallpaper. Holmes gestured toward the last door on the right. A faint chemical tang hung in the air. He produced a set of slender tools and worked the lock quietly. Within moments, the latch clicked open and we slipped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a half-covered oil lamp on a small desk near the far wall. The air was close and stale, tinged with the distinct odour of ink, scorched metal, and something bitterly medicinal. The space was modest, but meticulously arranged. A writing table sat against the wall, covered in sheaves of parchment, cuttings from newspapers, and small bottles containing residues of iridescent ink. A leather valise stood open on the bed, revealing foreign documents, wax-sealed envelopes, and a number of official-looking papers bearing the crests of various ministries. Holmes moved swiftly and silently, rifling through the contents with clinical precision. "Government memos," he muttered, holding up a page marked Confidential, Office of Naval Procurement. And here, Foreign Office dispatches from Vienna. These were never intended for public view. I picked up a folded sheet near the desk. This one bears the signature of Undersecretary Moffat. "Stolen or purchased," Holmes said grimly. "Either way, these are the sources from which he constructed his letters." Holmes moved to the corner where an old coat rack bore a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy dark overcoat. He examined the lapel, then withdrew a small folding mirror from his pocket and angled it beneath the brim. "A faint powder," he said, "likely to neutralize exposure from the ink's toxins. Our man is no fool." Suddenly, Holmes froze. From the stairwell below came a sound, the squeal of the front door hinges, followed by deliberate, slow steps ascending the staircase. Holmes blew out the lamp and motioned for silence. We moved swiftly into the darkness, pressing ourselves against either side of the doorframe. The footsteps paused outside the flat. Keys jangled softly, then turned in the lock. The door opened. A man entered, tall and thin, his shoulders cloaked in shadow. His face was sharp, with a well-groomed beard and a high forehead. As he stepped into the room, he closed the door behind him and crossed to the desk, unaware of our presence. Holmes moved first. With a swift motion, he stepped forward and brought the point of his cane sharply across the man's wrist. The intruder cried out, dropping the sheaf of letters he had picked up. I leapt from my post, locking the door behind us. "Good evening, Mr. Verek," Holmes said calmly. "Or should I call you by your given name, Radoslav Verek, former attaché to the Balkan legation and currently a fugitive in 2 countries. Verek's expression flickered only briefly before settling into a cold smile. "So," he said in flawless English, "the younger Holmes comes sniffing after shadows. I had expected Mycroft." Holmes kept his tone even. "Mycroft prefers diplomacy. I favour resolution." Verek slowly straightened. "You have no warrant, no charges. This is sovereign ground as far as your laws are concerned. But your methods are not," Holmes said. "Stolen documents, bribed officials, chemical weapons disguised as ink. You sought to destabilize the treaty by igniting London's press. It was clever, but it ends here." Verek's eyes flashed. "You cannot stop the truth, Mr. Holmes. The scandals were real. I merely revealed what your own government tried to bury." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But you timed your revelations with surgical precision, not for truth's sake, but to destroy negotiations. That makes you not a journalist, but a saboteur." I noticed then that Verek's hand had slipped toward the coat on the rack. Holmes saw it too. "Do not reach for the coat," Holmes said coolly, "unless you wish to find out whether I carry a pistol." "I do not, but Watson does." Reluctantly, Verek stepped away. Holmes gathered the letters and placed them into a satchel, along with the bottles of ink and the foreign documents. "You will not get far," Verek said quietly. "There are others like me, and they are already in position." "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "But tonight, they are one man fewer." Within the hour, Verek was escorted into the custody of military intelligence, summoned by Holmes via special courier. Mycroft himself would see to the arrangements, for this case, as Holmes had predicted, had reached beyond Baker Street and into the corridors of international power. As we walked back through the fog-wreathed streets toward home, Holmes said nothing for some time. Then at last, he murmured, "Truth is rarely pure, Watson, and never simple. But the manipulation of truth, that is the greater crime." And with that, he disappeared once more into the swirling London mist. Chapter 10. The Final Letter. It was not yet dawn when Holmes burst into our sitting room, the folds of his coat trailing behind him like a tattered banner. His eyes were bright, alert, and tinged with urgency. He carried no satchel, no fresh documents, only a small, crumpled telegram in his gloved hand. "The game is not over," he said flatly. I sat upright at once. "Veric?" "Detained," Holmes replied, "but not before he dispatched a final letter, one I failed to anticipate." I stood. "To whom?" He held up the telegram. "To the Right Honourable Edmund Willoughby, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs." My heart sank. "If he opens it," Holmes cut me off, "it will not kill him, but the contents will do worse. According to what we found in Veric's quarters, the letter contains fabricated correspondence implicating Willoughby in secret dealings with a foreign bank. Letters forged with stolen signatures and real documents modified just enough to seem damning. A scandal of that magnitude would collapse the treaty and bring down half the cabinet," Holmes said grimly. "The Foreign Secretary would have no choice but to resign under suspicion. The press would have a field day, and the trust built over months of negotiation would unravel overnight." He threw on his scarf and turned toward the door. "We have less than an hour before the Foreign Secretary's first appointment. If he checks his post early, as he is wont to do, the damage will be done." "Then we must reach him first," I said, grabbing my coat. We hurried down Baker Street, then through the silent avenues of Mayfair, the early morning fog curling along the ground like a living thing. No hansom cab could move faster than Holmes's long strides that morning. We reached Carlton House Terrace, where the Foreign Office maintained its private residence, just as the gas lamps were beginning to sputter into daylight. A footman stood outside the gate, adjusting the collar of his uniform. Holmes strode directly up to him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, here by order of military intelligence," he said. "We must see the Foreign Secretary at once, a matter of national urgency." The footman hesitated, confused by the sudden arrival. "He has just risen, sir. He usually reviews his correspondence during breakfast." "Then we are already late," Holmes muttered, pushing past him. We were shown to the morning room, where Edmund Willoughby, a dignified man with grey side whiskers and a perpetually weary expression, sat with a silver tray of toast, tea, and a neatly stacked pile of unopened correspondence at his side. He looked up in mild surprise. "Mr. Holmes, I was not expecting a visit at this hour." Holmes made no effort to sit. "You have received a letter this morning." No return address, heavy paper, faint metallic sheen in the ink. Willoughby, slightly alarmed, turned to the stack. "Why, yes, I noticed the odd texture. It is here." He reached for the envelope. Holmes lunged forward. "Do not touch it," he snapped. "The ink is laced with a chemical compound that causes blistering burns. We've seen 3 editors injured already." Willoughby's hand froze an inch from the envelope. "Good Lord," he said quietly, withdrawing. "And the contents?" "Forged documents designed to implicate you in financial impropriety," Holmes replied. "The forgery is detailed but ultimately traceable. It is meant to destroy your credibility and collapse the treaty negotiations." Willoughby's face paled as he reached for a pair of tongs and lifted the envelope into a porcelain basin used for ash. "This is Veric's work?" Holmes gave a sharp nod. The final blow in a series of calculated disclosures, all part of an effort to unseat the British delegation from within. Willoughby turned to the butler at the door. "Send a man to General Whittington's office. Tell him Veric's communication has been intercepted, and Mr. Holmes is to be given full access to the documents." As the butler departed, Willoughby returned his gaze to Holmes. "You have spared this government a profound humiliation, and perhaps more importantly, you have preserved a fragile peace." Holmes merely inclined his head, Truth can withstand time and scrutiny, but it cannot survive the flames of deliberate distortion. We left Carlton House Terrace as the sun finally broke through the mist, warming the damp pavement underfoot. Holmes walked in silence for some time, his gaze distant, the collar of his coat turned against the breeze. "You look dissatisfied," I remarked. "Not dissatisfied," he said at last, "merely aware that for every Veric exposed, there may be another in his place already writing the next letter." "And yet," I said, this one was stopped. Holmes offered a faint smile. "For now, Watson, for now." Chapter 11. Ink and Influence. 3 days had passed since the letter intended for the Foreign Secretary was safely intercepted. Thanks to Holmes's swift intervention, the letter became a piece of evidence rather than a weapon. Its exposure unravelled the final thread of the conspiracy. Radoslav Verek, now identified and detained under the Official Secrets Act, was turned over to British intelligence and interrogated in a secure compound outside London. He never denied authorship of the letters, nor the forgeries, nor the toxins. In fact, according to Mycroft Holmes, who oversaw parts of the inquiry, Verek seemed almost pleased with his capture, like a playwright whose final act had received the attention it deserved. His crime, Mycroft later said, was not against any individual but against the very notion of objective truth. When pressed on his motivation, Verek offered a single, measured response. The truth, left unguarded, becomes a lie in waiting. The government kept the matter classified. Only a carefully worded statement was released to the public citing foreign interference in confidential communications and the prevention of a severe diplomatic rupture. No trials, no names, quiet resolution in the interest of national stability. Holmes, however, did not let the story rest. "You recall," he said to me one afternoon as we sat in our rooms at Baker Street, "the name Petrovich?" "Of course," I replied. "You suspected he was involved." "He was," Holmes confirmed. "Petrovich is Verek's cousin, not by blood, but by allegiance. Petrovich once served in the Eastern Intelligence Division of his country's internal ministry. Verek's actions were not those of a lone saboteur. He was the instrument. Petrovich was the composer." "Then why was Petrovich not arrested?" I said. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Diplomatic immunity. The Crown is not in the habit of sparking wars over shadows and ink." He walked to the fireplace where the day's post lay unopened. "But the message was received, Watson. The treaty held. The scandal was undone before it could erupt. Verek's plot failed." "And yet," I said, "he seemed content in defeat." Holmes nodded slowly. "Because he believed in the fragility of perception. His goal was never simply to destroy careers, it was to show how easily public trust can be turned into a weapon. That poison can be poured not into a chalice, but into a headline." He paused, lifting a folded newspaper. "He used truth like a skeleton, and lies as its flesh. And in a world as hungry for information as ours, that is a dangerously effective formula." As the fire crackled, I returned to my notebook and began to write the final lines of the case. Radoslav Verek had authored no death, spilled no blood, fired no shot. Yet his scheme nearly reshaped the political architecture of Europe. All with words, all with ink. The true mystery was not how he forged the letters, but how close the world came to believing them. And in that realization lay Holmes's greatest triumph, not in discovering who had written the poisoned letters, but in reminding us all that even in an age of headlines and telegrams, the sharpest blade remains the unseen hand behind the page. And so concludes the puzzle of the poisoned ink, a tale where no one died, yet entire governments nearly fell, not by blade or bullet, but by the quiet violence of a well-placed lie. Once again, Sherlock Holmes has proven that the sharpest tool in his arsenal is not force, but reason. That, in a world increasingly shaped by words, it is our ability to see through illusion that protects us most. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your thoughts clear, and beware the ink that burns.